Joan Birch had never considered herself a confrontational person, but there was something about dry land and bureaucratic arrogance that made her blood simmer in a way she hadn't felt since the early years of running her business. When she signed the purchase agreement for the 10-acre parcel just outside the incorporated boundary line of Dryfield, Arizona, she hadn't anticipated resistance. The land was quiet, rugged, and undeveloped, exactly what she needed for the next expansion of her operations. Her bakery and local goods store in town had outgrown its leased kitchen, and she was finally in a financial position to build a dedicated production space with room to experiment, store, and distribute directly from her own property. The parcel came without infrastructure, but that didn't bother her. She was ready for autonomy, solar panels, septic system, and, most importantly, a well. That water would be the cornerstone of the new facility, not just for baking and cleaning, but for irrigation, cooling, and in the long term, even packaging. The permit was secured from the state's Department of Water Resources. The Geological Survey had shown strong aquifer access with minimal draw risk, and a reputable drilling company had given her a start date within 2 weeks. She had double-checked everything herself. There were no easements on the land, no overlapping water rights, and no community restrictions. At least, that's what the public records claimed. The first indication that something wasn't right came in the form of a manila envelope shoved halfway into her mailbox. Not mailed, not even stamped, just hand-delivered and left there like an afterthought. The seal was a generic logo printed in grayscale. Community Resource Oversight Board, a name she'd never encountered in any of the zoning packets or permit discussions. Inside was a 2-page letter written in officious legal tone, informing her that a temporary moratorium had been placed on non-essential subsurface excavation, citing aquifer stability concerns and the need for further hydrological review before continued groundwater extraction licensing could proceed. She read it twice, then again, slower. The letter was unsigned, no contact name, only an email address and a hotline number that rang 5 times before dumping her into a voicemail box titled Public Liaison Desk. Joan was no stranger to nonsense. She'd run a business through recession, pandemic, and theft. But this was different. This was someone inserting themselves where they had no authority. She immediately contacted her well driller, who confirmed they'd received a similar letter and, following legal advice, were suspending all work orders in that postal zone until things get clarified. It wasn't just a delay, it was a dead stop. Joan spent the next day making phone calls to every agency she could think of. The Water Resources Department, the County Records Office, even the Town Planning Office, despite her land being outside their jurisdiction. No one had heard of this oversight board. The name wasn't attached to any registered government body. Eventually, she spoke with a woman at the county supervisor's office who admitted, hesitantly, that certain communities in the region had formed advisory collectives that sometimes issued guidance on land use. Though, she added quickly, such bodies had no legal enforcement power unless ratified through formal charter or statute. Joan had that call on speakerphone while staring at the water permit pinned on her fridge like a challenge. If this wasn't legally binding, then why was her contractor backing off? Why were companies suddenly hesitant to come near her land? That evening, she drove the boundary of her property and saw the signs. New, bright yellow, staked into the scrub. Water Preservation Zone. No excavation. There were 3 of them. None were on her side of the fence line, but close enough to send a message. Someone was broadcasting a claim over her land, quietly, without asking, and without any real right. Still, she didn't react publicly. Joan believed in strategy over spectacle. She spent the next few days revisiting her paperwork, scanning every title detail, every water map, and plat survey she had. The deeper she looked, the more she noticed what hadn't been there before. Assumptions. Assumptions that because her land was rural, it was untouched. That, because she had a permit, she had protection. That, because she was operating within the law, others would be as well. It was a fool's assumption, and she was no fool. On a hunch, she contacted a friend from her supplier network who specialized in agricultural land transitions. He owed her a favor, and she asked if he could pull any utility or usage data from the past decade for her coordinates. 3 days later, she got an encrypted file containing what appeared to be a series of old irrigation infrastructure layouts, not just from her land, but from the broader valley. What caught her attention was a single notation, 4 letters, Incon 4, printed across an overlay right where her property sloped downward into a dry wash. She opened it in mapping software, scaled it against her deed, and saw it. A line cutting across the lower acreage of her land, matching perfectly with what had appeared to be an old drainage ditch. But it wasn't. It was a buried supply line. And it wasn't hers. That night, she walked the ditch with a flashlight, careful not to step too loudly. She wasn't trespassing. This was still her land. But the darkness carried weight. The wind hissed low across the chaparral, and the flashlight flickered slightly as she traced the shallow rut downhill. Halfway down, she found a plastic access cover mostly buried in sand, barely visible under a layer of old weeds. She pried it open with a tire iron, crouched low, and saw the truth. A PVC pipeline, new enough to gleam in the beam of her light. She didn't touch it. She didn't even take a photo. She just stared, heart slowly rising into her throat. Whoever had installed this did it without right, likely years ago when the land was owned by a trust with no in-person oversight, and they had kept it quiet all this time, siphoning off groundwater through her property to somewhere else, somewhere large, somewhere industrial. By morning, Joan had filed a request for public infrastructure verification through the county, citing inconsistencies in utility records. She didn't accuse anyone. Not yet. She just asked the question, "Is there a registered service line on my land?" Within 48 hours, she received the response, "No such line exists. No permits, no easements, no recorded access rights." The water was being pulled illegally, quietly, and someone had just blocked her well to protect that theft. That's when she made her second call. Not to her contractor, not to her lawyer, but to a man named Marcus Kendall, a specialist in utility law and one of the few people in the state with experience in groundwater appropriation disputes involving private landowners. She didn't ask him to sue. She asked him to watch. Because Joan had no interest in legal fireworks, not yet. What she wanted was accountability. Quiet, undeniable, permanent. 3 days later, she received another envelope, this one certified. Inside was a notice of motion from a livestock company 3 miles down canyon, claiming emergency injunctive relief against subsurface interference on grounds that her intended excavation posed immediate risk to the structural integrity of shared water infrastructure. There was no mention of the illegal pipe, no mention of her permit. Just a sudden legal assault, designed to reframe her as the aggressor. Joan sat at her table sipping burnt coffee and staring out at the brittle land she had paid for. Her fingers tapped against the rim of the mug, not with fear, but with calculation. If they were so desperate to protect that line, it must be vital, which meant she wasn't just a threat to them. She was leverage. And that's when Joan Birch decided no one would drink from her land unless they paid for every last drop. The motion for injunctive relief was, in legal terms, an aggressive bluff, but Joan knew better than to treat it lightly. She handed the document over to Marcus Kendall, who read through it with the expression of a surgeon evaluating a benign but growing tumor. The language was excessive, filled with urgent adjectives and theoretical risks. Destabilization, contamination, infrastructural collapse. Nowhere did it mention the pipeline they had secretly routed through her land. Nowhere did it reference the fact that her planned well had been permitted by the state and lay hundreds of feet above any shared utility access. That omission wasn't just deliberate, It was strategic. They weren't trying to win a legal argument. They were trying to set the narrative and, more dangerously, control the timeline. If the injunction succeeded, it would halt all development indefinitely, pending court review, which could stretch for months or longer depending on the influence of the plaintiffs. And influence, it seemed, they had in spades. Marcus leaned back in her kitchen chair with a sigh and looked her in the eye. "This isn't about the well," he said. "This is about control. They've been using that line for years, illegally, and the moment you tapped into the aquifer legally, they panicked. They didn't expect someone like you to know how to fight back." Joan didn't smile. She didn't respond at all. She simply reached into a folder beside her and handed him a copy of the original geological survey overlaid with her property map, including a highlighted section where the pipe crossed the southern portion of her land. Marcus looked at it, nodded slowly, and asked the only question that mattered. "How loud do you want this to be?" Joan took a long breath. "Not loud," she said. "Not yet. I want them confident. I want them careless." And just like that, the strategy shifted from defense to precision offense. The next morning, Joan received a visitor she hadn't expected. A tall, broad-shouldered man in dusty jeans and an embroidered company polo shirt stepped out of a white pickup and introduced himself as Terry Blackman, property liaison for the Dryfield Livestock Cooperative. He offered her a cup of drive-through coffee, which she declined, and a handshake, which she accepted with the flat expression of someone evaluating a used car. Terry had the confident ease of a man who'd spent years cutting deals in other people's kitchens. He complimented her land, praised her ambition, and noted, casually with the affect of a friendly neighbor, that water rights in that area could be a real tangled mess if you weren't careful. Joan didn't interrupt. She waited for the offer, which came dressed in honey. "Look, Joan, nobody's trying to cause you grief. It's just, things down valley run on a very tight cycle. That pipeline, it feeds over 1,500 head. One disruption in the water pressure, and we're looking at a six-figure loss. Now, if we could work out some kind of agreement, maybe compensate you for keeping that area clear. Say, an easement with a monthly credit. No burden on your side." But Joan had already heard enough. She stood, not rudely but clearly, and walked him back to the truck without a word. He got the message. Before he stepped up into the cab, he said one last thing, soft enough to sound polite, but firm enough to carry weight. "You've got a lot of opportunity here, Joan. No reason to burn bridges when we could all drink from the same stream." She watched his truck disappear in a cloud of gravel and dust, then went inside and closed her windows. That night, she moved the files from her kitchen to a locked fireproof cabinet in the utility room. Over the next week, things started to shift, quietly at first, then more obviously. 2 of her local suppliers dropped their delivery schedules without explanation, citing internal delays. A permit application she'd filed to install temporary solar panels on the new lot was returned with a request for clarification on panel wattage, something never required before. And a small ad she'd booked in the community newsletter was pulled without refund. When she inquired, the editor apologized vaguely and mumbled something about avoiding conflict during pending litigation. It wasn't subtle. It was pressure, coordinated and subtlety irrelevant. They were signaling to her that she was now a problem, and Dryfield didn't like problems. Joan didn't complain. She documented everything: emails, cancellations, invoices. Marcus compiled it all into a timeline, noting how quickly the chain of local cooperation unraveled once she refused the handshake. But it wasn't just economic. One evening, while checking her fence line, Joan discovered that someone had driven a vehicle into the south gate post. The metal was bent inward, the lock mechanism dislodged. It didn't look like vandalism. It looked like a reminder. She fixed it herself that night using a crowbar and a pair of concrete anchors. 2 nights later, she found her boundary marker flags pulled out and scattered into the brush. On the 3rd night, she stopped walking the fence and installed a motion-triggered camera instead. Not as a deterrent, she knew they didn't care about being seen, but for record-keeping. The system uploaded directly to cloud storage, bypassing her local network. If they were willing to operate this openly, they either believed she would fold or were counting on her to retaliate recklessly. Joan did neither. She ordered a second well analysis under a different license number and submitted it through her lawyer's office, using an LLC registered to a separate mailing address. She paid the deposit in cash. Her driller never knew it was the same parcel. By now, Marcus had contacted the state attorney's regional office, citing potential misappropriation of groundwater infrastructure and requesting a preliminary investigation. He didn't do this loudly. No press, no announcement. Just a quiet filing, backed with scanned documents, affidavits, and a clear map of where the buried line intersected Joan's land. It was enough to start the wheels turning, slowly, and with the indifference of institutional machinery. But that's all Joan needed. Not revenge, not drama, just inertia in the right direction. The same week, a civil engineer specializing in rural hydrodynamics performed an inspection of the suspected pipeline on her land. And though he didn't excavate directly, he submitted a sealed report indicating likely unauthorized resource, transmission beneath her property. That report was shared with the livestock company's insurers, who, under obligation, initiated an internal audit. Within days, the tone shifted. Joan received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was an attorney, mid-tier, likely not their primary litigator, calling to open a conversation about mutual interests in preserving water access. Joan let Marcus take the call. His response was simple. "You've been taking water illegally for over a decade. My client has the right to full control over all subsurface structures on her land, and we're exploring removal options. You'll be notified through the appropriate channels." The attorney, to his credit, did not bluff. He thanked Marcus for his time and ended the call. That silence, that lack of counter-threat, was more revealing than any argument. They knew they were cornered, and if they were smart, they knew the game was about to change. Joan spent that evening in quiet reflection, not celebrating, not exhaling, just sitting on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the dry wind move across the horizon like a slow promise. Her property had become a battlefield, not of guns or noise, but of leverage, resource, and quiet defiance. What they hadn't counted on was that Joan didn't want to negotiate. She didn't want compensation. She wanted separation. And she was going to make sure that not a single drop of water would pass through her land again. Not for free, and not for them. Joan wasn't someone who rushed decisions, and she knew that decisive moments often came disguised as inconvenience. She spent the first 2 days after the lawyer's call walking her land at dawn and dusk, watching how the light fell across the ridges and where shadows pooled in the low parts of the terrain. She paid attention to things others might have missed, the subtle depression in the gravel where a vehicle had turned too tightly, the changed angle of a section of her fence that had sagged slightly despite being reinforced just last month, the faint smell of oil near the south property line where no machinery had run in weeks. These weren't accidents. They were signs, subtle but deliberate, indications that pressure was shifting, that whoever had been managing the underground siphoning operation had realized they were out of time. They weren't sabotaging her openly, not yet, but they were probing, testing for weakness, trying to determine how far they could go before she'd break formation and retaliate in a way they could exploit. Joan didn't flinch. Instead, she submitted a formal notice of property control change to the county registrar, a move that seemed bureaucratic on paper but had sharp legal teeth. It asserted that she was updating the official record to indicate new terms of access on her land, which would require any existing easements to be validated within 30 days or face permanent revocation. She attached survey documents, previous correspondences, and a notarized affidavit stating that no known access agreements had ever been transferred to her upon purchase. The county, predictably, responded with a polite acknowledgement and a vague warning that these matters may require judicial interpretation if challenged. Joan had anticipated that and already looped Marcus into the documentation chain. She didn't need the county's help. She needed a paper trail that couldn't be erased. The retaliation came swiftly and precisely. 3 days after the filing, her bakery storefront was cited by the local health board for an alleged violation involving improper gray water management, an accusation both laughable and expensive. Her water system had been inspected only 2 months prior and cleared without issue, but the new inspector found what he called non-conforming runoff indicators and threatened a temporary closure. Joan didn't argue. She simply requested his report in writing and noted that he had arrived without appointment and refused to sign the entry log. When he left, she sent the footage to Marcus. That night, her produce delivery was delayed with no explanation, and one of her regular drivers left a voicemail. "Joan, I'm sorry, but I was told not to come out there this week. Orders from dispatch." She didn't blame him. She didn't call the distributor either. She ordered dry storage goods instead and shifted her menu to non-perishables. Customers noticed, asked questions. She didn't offer answers. It wasn't fear. It was focus. Marcus had begun assembling a case not just for property violation but for constructive interference, and his evidence was beginning to accumulate. But that wasn't the part that mattered most. What mattered was the trench. Joan hadn't touched the pipe directly, not since discovering it, but she had quietly contracted a geotechnical firm to perform a soil integrity assessment across the southern edge of her parcel. Under the pretense of studying erosion risk, they used sonar mapping and light excavation to chart the exact depth and curvature of the buried pipeline. What they found confirmed her suspicion. The line had been rerouted at least twice over the years and included a control valve buried just 2 feet beneath the surface near the wash's eastern bend, squarely within her property. That valve, Joan now understood, wasn't just a junction. It was a choke point, and whoever controlled it could, in theory, control the entire downstream flow of water into the livestock facility. She didn't mention this to Marcus immediately. She wanted to be certain. She hired an independent hydrologist to model the output variations, using publicly available draw data from the state's own resource dashboards. The findings were conclusive. Even a partial closure at that valve could reduce pressure downstream by over 70%, effectively choking the supply. That made Joan's land more than valuable. It made it indispensable. The next morning, Terry Blackman returned. This time, he brought someone else, a woman named Marla Keyes, who introduced herself as a conflict mediator. She was sharp, well-spoken, and carried herself with the weary grace of someone used to pretending they weren't there to deliver bad news. She spoke about community cohesion, the dangers of escalation, and how sometimes misunderstandings could spiral out of proportion. Joan said nothing. Marla eventually stopped, sensing the silence wasn't passive. It was precise. Terry stepped in again, offering a revised compensation structure. This time, it wasn't just a cash offer. They were offering a stake in a new cooperative, access to supply chains, and a partnership with long-term benefits. Joan finally spoke. "You want to legalize theft by handing me a fraction of the profits from what you already stole. Why would I want that?" Marla didn't flinch. She simply said, "Because some people would rather have a piece of the pie than none at all." Joan looked her dead in the eye. "I'd rather burn the kitchen." That night, the eastern fence line was cut. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just a clean, obvious slice through the wire. Marcus called the next morning and said simply, "We file today." The civil suit was straightforward. Unauthorized infrastructure use, trespass by utility, and damages related to obstruction and interference. But Joan added one more line at the bottom of the claim. Notice of intent to reclaim physical access to all underground systems within her parcel, including removal of foreign objects not registered with the county. Marcus asked if she was serious. Joan didn't answer. She didn't have to. She went to the shed, pulled out her field gloves, and called the same contractor who'd originally been scheduled to drill her well. They didn't answer. She tried a second company. Same response. Finally, she called a drilling team from across the county line, one that specialized in emergency repair work. She didn't say it was a well. She said it was access repair for an old irrigation line that needed replacement. That wasn't a lie. When the crew arrived, they worked fast. Joan stood nearby with a clipboard keeping watch. The moment they hit the access cap, pressure hissed from the pipe like a wound. The drill operator looked up, confused. "This isn't irrigation," he said. Joan nodded. "Number, it's not." She signed the invoice and told them to leave the site open. Once they left, she walked back to her house, locked the door, and called Marcus. "We're ready," she said. "Tell them the clock's ticking." That night, she didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew what came next. They weren't going to go through lawyers anymore. They were going to come directly. The next move didn't come through legal paperwork or passive-aggressive visits. It arrived in the form of silence. For 3 full days after the pipeline was exposed, no one came. No messages, no calls, no vehicles passing by with casual slowness. Joan watched the edge of her property with the attention of a soldier waiting for movement in a minefield. She maintained her bakery's reduced operations without complaint, showed up at the storefront, swept the porch, checked deliveries, took orders, all while knowing something was shifting beyond her view. When the response did come, it came in the form of an anonymous complaint to the State Environmental Health Division, alleging that Joan had conducted unauthorized excavation of critical water infrastructure, leading to a contamination hazard. The wording was careful but aggressive, clearly written by someone with legal knowledge. Within 48 hours, 2 inspectors arrived on her land with clipboards and latex gloves, asking to see where the disturbance had occurred. Joan did not refuse them. She welcomed them directly to the site, presented documentation of her property ownership, soil survey permissions, photographs of the unmarked pipe, and the hydrological report that indicated the structure's unregistered status. She did not accuse, she only documented. When one inspector asked if she knew who had installed the pipe, she answered plainly, "If I did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. They'd be having it with you." The inspectors left without sealing the site. Their report, submitted 2 days later, contained no violations, only a recommendation for full mapping and documentation of the underground line for clarity and record-keeping. Joan knew this was as close to an admission as she was going to get from the state, that the system in question wasn't sanctioned, and that she was within her rights to manage her own land. But while the state was being cautious, the opposing side was not. That same night, someone trespassed on her land. The camera caught the shadow of a figure near the excavation site, but the footage was incomplete. Just enough movement to indicate intrusion, but no clear face, no identifying marks. Joan didn't bother sending it to the sheriff. Instead, she sent it to Marcus with the subject line, "They blinked first." Marcus didn't respond for a full day. When he did, he said only, "I've contacted the Water Control Board. They're reviewing the case for illegal draw. We may get an injunction on our side before this reaches court." But Joan knew better than to put faith in regulatory bodies whose gears turned too slowly to matter in a crisis. That's why she took action without waiting. She hired a team, not private security, not enforcers, but a licensed infrastructure repair company that specialized in decommissioning abandoned or obsolete water lines. When they arrived, she presented the excavation site as an unauthorized buried system requiring removal for safety. She had the paperwork to back it up, and more importantly, the company wasn't local. They didn't answer to Dryfield, and they didn't care about politics. Within 6 hours, the crew had excavated and extracted 28 feet of PVC pipeline, capped the exposed ends with pressure seals, and handed her a confirmation receipt listing the object as non-compliant unregistered utility line, removed and neutralized. Joan signed the form, paid in cash, and had the crew dispose of the segment at a reclamation yard out of town. The section that remained underground was now split in two, severed at the choke point. It was irreversible. From that moment forward, no water was flowing through her land to the livestock operation. 2 days later, panic set in. She heard it first from a delivery driver who'd stopped by her store early in the morning. "You didn't hear it from me," he said, "but there's been a water emergency out by the ranch. They've got tankers lined up since yesterday. Rumor is the pumps dropped to nothing overnight." Joan nodded without reaction, thanked him, and rang up his bread. But inside, her pulse was steady, cool. This was exactly the result she had expected, though not celebrated. There was no sense of triumph, only confirmation. They had depended on stolen flow for too long and had no contingency plan when it finally stopped. What followed next was a sequence of missteps so predictable it almost bored her. First came the trucks, bringing in temporary water tanks to keep the livestock alive. Then came the local news coverage of the unexpected supply disruption, though no mention was made of why. And finally, the public plea from the Dryfield Livestock Cooperative requesting temporary regional assistance in maintaining water access during infrastructure restoration. Joan didn't comment. She didn't need to. But the real shift came 3 days after the story broke, when a man in a pressed suit showed up at her bakery. Not in anger, not in confrontation, but with a folder under his arm and a tired smile on his face. He introduced himself as David Shaw, a senior partner representing the cooperative. His tone was different from Terry's or Marla's, not smooth, not charming, but careful, calculated. He asked to sit down. Joan allowed it. He said one sentence that changed everything. "We're prepared to admit fault if you're willing to negotiate terms of future access." Joan let him finish, waited in silence, then asked him to leave the folder and come back in 48 hours. She handed the folder to Marcus that evening. Inside were drafts of proposed agreements, revenue-sharing models, service contracts, long-term water lease arrangements, all predicated on her cooperation and forgiveness of past trespass. Marcus's advice was cautious. "They're folding, but they want dignity. If you refuse them outright, they'll lash out one more time before it's over." Joan stared out the window. "Let them. I want it clean." She knew this was the turning point. Not the legal midpoint of a case, but the structural moment when power truly shifted. The ranch was crippled. The pipeline was cut. The regulators were circling. And now the people who had once tried to bully her into silence were sitting at her table begging for scraps. Joan didn't feel vindicated. She felt ready. They'd had their time. Now it was hers. Joan understood, perhaps better than anyone, that powerful people seldom accept defeat gracefully, especially when the foundation of their dominance begins to collapse under something as seemingly simple and undeniable as the reassertion of individual property rights. The water stoppage hadn't just impacted the livestock operation financially, it had humiliated them. A private landowner, a baker by trade with no political influence and no institutional backing, had unilaterally severed their access to a resource they had come to treat as theirs by right, and done so without fanfare, without litigation, without warning. It undermined everything they had built, not structurally, but symbolically. For the first time in over a decade, the ranch wasn't dictating terms, and while their legal representatives had started to soften their tone, seeking to negotiate salvage rather than conquest, others behind the scenes had no interest in compromise. They wanted the situation reversed, and quickly, and they were willing to abandon legality altogether to accomplish it. The first move was almost elegant in its simplicity. 3 permits previously granted to Joan's business, for signage, temporary food storage, and vehicle loading, were revoked in rapid succession by the local zoning committee. The reasoning given was incomplete disclosure of utility modifications. Marcus filed 3 appeals within 24 hours, attaching photographic evidence and timelines showing compliance, but they both understood the point wasn't to win or lose. The individual revocations. It was to paralyze her expansion through bureaucratic warfare. Joan adjusted accordingly. She consolidated operations to her original space, reduced production to essentials, and moved her inventory distribution to a subscription model. Customers noticed, some complained, but most stayed loyal. Then came the anonymous tip to the State Board of Taxation, claiming Joan was operating with undeclared income. An auditor was dispatched, though the claim didn't withstand even basic scrutiny. Joan kept meticulous records. The audit was closed within a week, but again, that hadn't been the goal. It was death by distraction, and they hoped she would either crack under the stress or slip up in a way they could exploit. What they hadn't counted on was how much stronger she had become through repetition. Each new pressure point was simply another logistical exercise, another problem to prioritize and manage. But Joan also understood that resilience alone wasn't enough. She needed to regain control of the narrative, not in the public sense, but in the operational structure of her life. She needed to secure her flank. That's why she reached out to an infrastructure law specialist from New Mexico, a woman named Dr. Elise Marine, whose doctoral work involved rural utility sovereignty and precedent-setting cases of landowner rights in post-industrial water conflicts. Dr. Marin agreed to consult and reviewed Joan's entire case history, including maps, filings, camera footage, and deconstruction records. Her conclusion was simple and definitive. Not only had Joan been within her rights to remove the unauthorized pipeline, she was now entitled to petition for damages based on both unauthorized use and retaliatory obstruction of commerce. Marcus had already prepared a preliminary filing for civil damages, but with Dr. Marin's expert testimony, they could escalate the claim to include economic retaliation and intentional suppression of trade, terms that carried legal weight far beyond a local water dispute. As Marcus and Dr. Marin worked to construct the next phase of the legal strategy, Joan focused on reinforcement. She installed commercial-grade fencing along the southern perimeter of her land, not just to deter trespassing, but to create a visible, irrefutable boundary that would eliminate any future ambiguity about access or intent. She contracted a local builder to erect a small field station on the exposed excavation site, an unassuming structure, technically registered as an agricultural monitoring post, but designed to permanently cover and secure the access point to the former pipeline junction. The building was equipped with off-grid power and environmental monitoring tools, and she registered it with the county under standard agricultural exemptions. There was nothing illegal about it, and that was precisely the point. She wasn't hiding anything. She was documenting everything. The day the structure was completed, she sent notification to the Dryfield Livestock Cooperative, informing them that the site was now sealed and monitored, and that any attempt to modify or approach the area without legal permission would be treated as trespass and reported accordingly. That same night, the gloves came off. Joan awoke to a low rumble just before dawn, a sound too steady to be thunder and too unnatural to be wind. When she stepped outside, she saw the glow, pale orange, flickering near the southern ridge. She ran, boots half-laced, jacket unzipped, flashlight in hand. It wasn't the field station. It was the fencing, burning, deliberate, concentrated. Someone had soaked a 10-foot section in accelerant and lit it from the brush side, timing it perfectly to the pre-dawn darkness when no one would see or interfere. Joan extinguished it herself with a fire extinguisher and garden hose, teeth clenched, heart steady. The fire hadn't reached the building. It hadn't even crossed the first barrier. But it had sent a message, as clear as anything. We're done pretending. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't waste time with empty reports. Instead, she compiled the camera footage, documented the burn pattern, and sent everything to Marcus and Dr. Marin. Their response was immediate. Joan's legal filing for damages was now accompanied by a protective injunction request, citing deliberate sabotage, economic coercion, and escalating threats to personal safety. But the most critical change came from Elise herself. She contacted the state's Department of Environmental Control directly, citing her credentials and submitting a full dossier of the illegal pipeline, the sabotage timeline, and the cooperative's long-term misuse of land and resources. Within 72 hours, a task force was approved for on-site inspection, not just of Joan's land, but of the entire water network feeding the livestock facility. The ranch panicked. Tankers reappeared, trucks idled for hours, livestock were moved off-site in visible haste. News didn't cover it, but people saw. Neighbors began to whisper. Small businesses that had quietly distanced themselves from Joan now reached out, expressing interest in renewable infrastructure partnerships and asking if she planned to scale her water system. Joan responded politely, but made no promises. She wasn't building a coalition. She was securing a perimeter. When the inspection team arrived, she provided full access, full documentation, and a statement of intent that her land was to remain self-governed, off-grid, and non-cooperative with any entity that had previously violated its boundaries. The inspectors were thorough. They mapped what remained of the illegal pipeline, verified her destruction of the main line, and concluded that the livestock operation had, for years, relied on unauthorized access through her property. The report was filed. Penalties were pending, and most critically, the cooperative's request for emergency water rights renewal was frozen, pending litigation. The next offer Joan received came not from lawyers but from a private representative, an older man with clean boots and a quiet tone. He didn't introduce himself by name. He said only, "They want to settle." Privately, quietly, "You name the terms." Joan listened, silent, stone-faced. The man handed her a handwritten note with a number, a high number, more than market value, more than any settlement to date for a land-based water dispute in the county. She folded the paper, looked at him, and replied without emotion. "They won't get a single drop. Not now, not ever." He didn't argue. He nodded once, then walked back to his truck and drove away. That night, Joan walked her land. The air was clean, sharp. The fence had been repaired. The field station stood untouched. No lights in the distance. No more fires. For the first time in months, there was only stillness. But she didn't let her guard down. She understood what came next. When power couldn't intimidate, couldn't buy, couldn't sabotage, it vanished. It cut its losses and regrouped elsewhere. But she would remain, rooted, prepared, in control. Because now, for the first time, the land was truly hers. Not just on paper, but in practice. Every inch earned, every drop protected. Joan had never been one to celebrate prematurely, and she certainly didn't mistake silence for surrender. After the anonymous emissary delivered their final offer, and she rejected it, the rhythm of things seemed to change again. It wasn't the chaos of escalation or the aggression of retaliation, but something subtler, colder. The movement around the livestock facility slowed to a crawl. The water tankers no longer buzzed past on the dirt road, and the once daily drone of equipment faded to silence. It was as if the ranch had folded in on itself, retreating behind its fences, conserving resources and waiting for some unseen clock to run out. But Joan knew there was no clock. There was only leverage, and she had taken theirs. The silence was not the end. It was the pressure before collapse. Then came the letter, Not from a lawyer or a cooperative, but from the regional branch of the Department of Natural Resources, addressed formally to Joan Birch, landowner. The language was measured, professional, but direct. The agency had opened an investigation into improper infrastructure placement and unauthorized groundwater usage by the Dryfield Livestock Cooperative. They requested her cooperation for a site visit and formal interview, noting that her previous reports and documentation had formed a basis for their inquiry. The visit was scheduled for the following week. Joan agreed without hesitation. The next 7 days moved with surgical clarity. She reviewed every file, rehearsed her timeline, and prepared every inch of her land for external scrutiny. She wasn't cleaning for inspection. She was staging the truth. When the state arrived, 3 vehicles, 6 agents, all carrying field kits and digital recorders, Joan greeted them with calm detachment. They split into teams, photographing the excavation site, logging coordinates, mapping the path of the old pipeline as marked by ground-penetrating radar. One agent, a tall woman with weathered hands and clipped speech, asked Joan to recount in full the history of the conflict. Joan spoke in detail: dates, decisions, offers, threats, removals. She made no accusations beyond the facts, pointed to no names that hadn't already signed documents or submitted claims. The agent listened, typed silently, and at the end said only, "Thank you." This corroborates what we've seen elsewhere. Elsewhere. That one word told Joan more than the rest of the interview combined. The problem wasn't isolated. This was systemic. The Dryfield Livestock Cooperative was not the only entity exploiting unregulated water access. But it was the one that had pushed too far, too arrogantly, and too publicly. And now it was going to pay the price for all of them. 3 days after the inspection, the agency issued an emergency order. The livestock facility was to cease all water-drawing operations pending review. The order was accompanied by a fine and a temporary asset freeze. Joan read the notice in full, then closed her laptop and stood for a long time at the edge of her kitchen counter, staring at nothing. It was done. Not finished, not resolved, but done. The infrastructure they had stolen, hidden, defended, it was officially labeled a violation. Their contracts would collapse. Their funding would dry up. They couldn't pay fines with water they no longer controlled. That evening, she returned to the southern edge of her land, the place where the illegal line had been exposed, severed, and finally removed. The field station sat quietly, undisturbed. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and powered on the monitoring unit, more out of habit than necessity. The screens blinked to life, displaying soil moisture, temperature readings, aquifer pressure. The numbers were stable. Her well was untouched. Her system balanced. As she stood in the glow of the soft light, a thought came, not triumphant, not bitter, but crystalline in its finality. There would be no more negotiating. No second chances. They had abused access, manipulated systems, harassed her through back channels, and when none of that worked, they'd tried to burn her out. And now, they were nothing more than a closed file, waiting for the penalty to land. At midnight, she received one final message, a voicemail from an unknown number. The voice was male, unfamiliar, tired. "You made your point. They're shutting us down. I don't know what happens next, but you did it. You really did it." The tone wasn't threatening. It wasn't even angry. It was hollow. Joan deleted the message without responding. She didn't need apologies. She didn't need witnesses. She had the land. She had her well. And for the first time since this began, she had a peace not as a compromise, but as a condition. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way only scorched earth can be quiet. There were no more letters, no more visits, no more trucks idling outside her fence pretending not to watch. The livestock operation down the ridge remained eerily still, its machinery silent, its pastures empty. Word trickled through the community in half-spoken tones. Some employees hadn't been paid, suppliers were canceling standing orders, and an auction was being prepared. Joan didn't attend it. She didn't gloat. She didn't even drive by. There was no satisfaction in watching someone else's structure collapse, even one built on theft. What mattered was that her boundary was intact. Her wellhead stood untouched, ringed in polished gravel, pressure stable, output pure. The monitoring station sent her updates once a day, and she barely looked at them now. Not because she didn't care, but because she no longer needed reassurance. The war was over. She had won. The cooperative dissolved in the 3rd month after the inspection report was made public. Their assets, land, machinery, cattle, were seized or sold to cover fines, lawsuits, and unpaid debts. The state never revealed the full list of violations discovered during the inspection, but people whispered falsified flow reports, altered infrastructure records, black market pipe installations stretching back a decade. It wasn't just a water theft scandal. It was a full-scale collapse of an empire built on entitlement. The town of Dryfield adjusted awkwardly, like a host waking from a long boozy party and realizing half the guests were thieves. Some of the same people who had shunned Joan months earlier now spoke her name with reverence. They didn't apologize, not directly, but the way they nodded when she passed on the sidewalk, the way they reopened business accounts and included her in regional planning meetings, those gestures told their own story. She didn't return the warmth. She stayed polite, professional, clear. She had learned that peace earned through war was not trust. It was just silence between storms. She never rebuilt the fence exactly as it was. Instead, she replaced the southern line with a double barrier. Steel posts, infrared sensors, a layer of drought-resistant bramble designed to cut any hand that dared reach through. It wasn't paranoia. It was memory. Some things, once burned, never forget the heat. She also expanded the field station, doubling its interior space and applying for a small business grant to convert it into a rural resource lab, providing soil testing, water sampling, and drought data to other local farmers. The state approved the grant within 3 weeks. She hired 2 technicians. The work kept her connected to the land, but also reminded her of the importance of self-reliance, not just in defense, but in presence. When she was asked to speak at a state conference on rural infrastructure rights, she declined the keynote, but agreed to a panel appearance. She spoke calmly, firmly, never raising her voice, never casting herself as a hero. They didn't lose because I was stronger, she told the room. They lost because they assumed no one would fight. I just didn't accept the terms they offered. The applause was brief and respectful. She left before the reception. Back home, she added one thing to her gate. Not a camera, not a guard post. Just a sign, painted in quiet white on dark wood, fixed with 2 bolts into the steel crossbeam. It read simply, "Private. No access." No exception. She didn't explain it to anyone. She didn't need to. Everyone who mattered had already learned what it meant.